Good afternoon. I'm Frank Gannon, and on behalf of the Richard Nixon Foundation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 12th in our series of Nixon Legacy Forums. In these forums, alumni of the Nixon administration and others who were involved in the events and issues of those years from 1969 to 1974 share their experiences and observations of what it was really like to be there as participants, day by day, actually developing and shaping the programs and policies that are now studied by a new generation as the stuff of history. We believe that as students and scholars begin to explore and examine the vast amount of archival materials, papers and tapes and artifacts that are now available at the Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, the Nixon administration will increasingly be seen, and particularly in its first term, and particularly on the domestic side, as one of the most interesting, inventive, creative, and yes, even enlightened of modern times. President Nixon's foreign policy acumen has been widely recognized, and some of the administration's major domestic initiatives in the environment and welfare reform and healthcare reform, the desegregation of southern schools, are increasingly acknowledged. But as today's forum on the administration's bold and effective approach to the problem of organized crime indicates, there were many other, perhaps less visible, but no less important programs and policies and initiatives being planned by able and motivated men and women, many of them very young men and women, in the White House and throughout the departments. Our next Legacy Forum will be on August 8th at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, and I invite you to join us then and there. The subject will be New Federalism, President Nixon's plans to share or return the power and resources of the federal government to the states. Past forum topics have included the environment, the creation of the Domestic Council and the OMB, Nixon's Hispanic initiatives, the scheduling and use of the president's time, the effective scheduling and use of the president's time, and Watergate. Future forum topics will include the all-volunteer Army, executive reorganization, women in the Nixon administration, Nixonomics, and Nixon and the courts. All of our Nixon Legacy Forums are filmed and can be viewed at the Foundation's website, nixonfoundation.org. Today we're joined by C-SPAN, by the C-SPAN cameras, and we warmly welcome all C-SPAN viewers. The Nixon Legacy Forums are jointly sponsored by the Nixon Foundation and the National Archives, and it is my privilege to introduce the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero. Mr. Ferriero served in top positions at the MIT and Duke University libraries before being named the director of the New York Public Libraries in 2004. In July of 2009, President Obama nominated him to be the 10th Archivist of the United States, and he was sworn in the following November. Among his many responsibilities are the 13 presidential libraries. Allow me to introduce the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero.
Thank you, Frank, and good afternoon. The National Archives and Records Administration is pleased to co-sponsor the Nixon Legacy Forums with the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's my pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. Our presidential libraries are truly national treasures. They protect, preserve, and make accessible to scholars and students and the general public the records and materials of 13 of the 44 men who have served as President of the United States. Before the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt, the organized preservation of the president's records didn't exist, and much of our history had been scattered or sold or lost or simply succumbed to the unkindness of inadequate storage. The Nixon presidency was remarkably and uniquely documented and recorded. The Nixon materials are the fullest and richest records of any administration in our history. With the opening of our new archival facility at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda last summer, scholars from America and all around the world will now be able to study the Nixon presidency in full and in depth and in one place. In effect, one-stop shopping for the Nixon presidency. We hope and trust that as word of the richness of the materials in Yorba Linda becomes more widely known, more and more people will travel there to study and learn from them. These Nixon Legacy Forums provide fascinating and instructive insights into those eventful and important years from 1969 to 1974, years that are in many ways so near and yet in many ways so far from us today. Of course, documents and tapes and other records are vitally important to knowing and analyzing and understanding what happened in the past and why, but the experiences and observations and memories of the men and women who were actually there, participating in the day-to-day development and planning, charged with the execution of an administration's policies, and in some cases, dealing directly with the President himself, are no less important and compelling. The Nixon Legacy Forum panels supply precisely that personal dimension to the unfolding of history. And on behalf of the National Archives, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here this afternoon. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's Legacy Forum on how the Nixon administration combated organized crime, Geoff Shepard. Geoff is a graduate of Whittier College, Richard Nixon's alma mater, and the Harvard Law School. He spent 5 years on the staff of the Nixon and Ford White Houses, first as a White House fellow assigned to the Treasury Department, and then in the White House as an associate director of the Domestic Council. Among his responsibilities there were the issues involving law and order. Geoff will lead today's Legacy Forum and introduce today's participants. Geoff?
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to do these forums with the National Archives because they have all the records. And you'll see today we've really mined the records for what we're going to show you. We have TV clips from evening news, and they're not, as we would say, of broadcast quality, but we're lucky we have them at all. We have papers, we have signing photographs, we have researched issue papers, and we have found charts that were used in congressional hearings that the National Archives very kindly has made available to us. So we couldn't do these forums without them. President Nixon ran as a law and order president and was elected as such. As we got into this topic, we decided it was simply too large to handle in a single forum. So we've got it divided into 4 parts. One is reducing street crime, which is a real challenge because it really is a state and local responsibility. There's going to be a second forum on Nixon and the courts and the work to change around the court system, where we had one time a feeling that crime and lawlessness might have been society's problem instead of the criminals, and that was addressed to a large extent under the Nixon presidency. And we also found, as we were researching this, the origins of counterterrorism. We had skyjackings, we had the beginnings of bombings and bombing issues, and you'll see it here as we go through some of this. And of course, we have the effort to combat organized crime. Interestingly, it is the effort to combat organized crime that came to fruition earliest. So it is entirely appropriate that this begin our panel. And the way we're going to begin this is with a clip from the evening news. The most significant law was the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970, and we have the news clips from all 3 national networks that we're going to show you during the course of the program. This particular clip is from CBS, and it features Mike Wallace and Dan Rather as young men.
President Nixon today signed the major anti-crime bill he had requested of the Congress. Dan Rather reports.
The President went to the Justice Department to dramatize his signing into law one of the more sweeping federal anti-crime bills in recent years. This law allows more wiretapping and electronic bugging, longer prison terms for mafia-style operations, the death penalty for bombings, and wide powers for FBI investigations on college campuses. After signing the law, President Nixon turned to Attorney General John Mitchell and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and ordered them to begin immediately with vigorous enforcement.
Gentlemen, I give you the tools, you do the job.
We will.
Mindful that crime, more than the economy, more than Vietnam, has become the issue that seems to concern most people most.
And that ends the clip from October of 1970 as shown by CBS. And while that's the high point legislatively of the effort to combat organized crime, in fact, the story starts much further back. And we've put up a slide here to show you. It began, from our point of view, way back in 1957 with the McClellan Rackets Committee in front of the Senate, where they started investigating and publicizing the control exercised over labor by organized crime. It ends with the signing of the Criminal Control Act, but there's also some things in between. There's really two bills of significance. The 1968 Omnibus Crime Control Act, which our participants will discuss, and the 1970 Organized Crime Control Act. And then something that's really unique in these forums, it involves one key meeting, which of course was the mob convention in Appalachia in 1957, where there were over 100 mobsters from around the country who were discovered in this remote hideaway, and the police started writing down license numbers. And it was absolute confirmation of national coordination by organized crime. And then we have two attorneys general. Robert Kennedy as Attorney General starting in 1961, and John Mitchell as Attorney General starting in 1969. And this is really intriguing. The men were prominent in different parties. They may have known each other, but they're never known to have worked together on anything. You may have strong political views about either or both of them. In their respective services, they were each the prime minister of the relative administration. They were the closest individual in the cabinet to the president. But from our perspective, in combating organized crime, they were the greatest attorney generals in our lifetime. They took it personally, they were heavily involved, and that involvement and that personal attention made a huge difference. So we're going to talk about all those things. I'm going to leave this up while we move to the members of our distinguished panel, and let me introduce them to you. I'm going to start with Professor Bob Blakey. Bob actually went to work at the Department of Justice when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General, and he was in the organized crime section. He's deceptively young and has really become the single greatest academic expert on organized crime. He not only was chief counsel to the Senate Subcommittee on Criminal Laws, but he also was the chief counsel of the Select House Committee on Assassinations, and he now teaches, where he has been since 1980, at Notre Dame Law School. And he's written a whole series of articles on organized crime. Next to Bob is Wally Johnson. Wally also began his career as one of the honor student hirees right out of law school into the Department of Justice. And he went from there and he worked on the organized crime strike force in Miami. So you have two individuals with personal experience in prosecuting organized crime. Wally then went to the Hill, and he was Senator Hruska's counsel, minority counsel, of the same Senate subcommittee on criminal laws. So both of these men worked for their respective senators, and these were the top staff individuals. Wally then went from there to become Associate Deputy Attorney General under John Mitchell. And at one point, he came over to the White House and was in charge of Senate Congressional Relations for the Congressional Relations staff, and finally back to the Department of Justice. It was an 11-year run as Assistant Attorney General for Lands and Natural Resources. So we've managed to find, Wally is also deceptively young, we've managed to find two people who worked together at this critical time when this was going on. Pete Velde, our third participant, did really the opposite. He started working on the Hill for Bob Michael, and then he came to the Department of Justice, and he was associated with the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration for many, many years as associate administrator and then as administrator, and then back to the Hill where he worked for Senate Judiciary. So we're really very fortunate to have people here who know more than, who've forgotten more than most of us will ever know about this unique time of coordination between the executive and the Congress on organized crime. We're going to have each of them speak briefly to set up the situation, and in general, Wally will speak first and talk about the need case, the problem with organized crime. Pete will talk about the steps that were taken and the legislation, and then Bob will talk about, in general, about the result and the efforts, the effects that were achieved. So we'll start with Wally.
Thank you, archivist, because we were able to recover what you're looking at from the National Archives and a report that was prepared back in the 1970s under Bob Blakey's aegis, but it represents the families in 1957. And in fact, what we're looking at is how this criminal organization became involved in every aspect of our life throughout the nation. Today, we don't see it the same way we saw it back then. I've got a metaphor I think about. I think of a coaxial cable, and you touched on this as we began this conversation. Every culture is like those strands that you find within a fiber cable. And Frank talked about civil rights and China and foreign affairs. One of those strands was organized crime. And the president was extremely focused on that during the campaign in 1968. It's before I was up on the Hill. I was running the strike force down in Florida myself. Let me see the next slide, if you would. So basically, as we've gone through the process of setting up this panel, there were two documents that were developed by President Nixon's staff where he paid absolutely high attention and priority to organized crime as a campaign issue back in the '68 election. There were so many things going on: crime in the streets, social chaos, the civil rights movement. Organized crime sometimes gets overlooked, but the fact is it was a major problem in our nation, and Nixon talked about it. Let me touch on the next. Take a look at that, and you'll see basically what he was saying during the campaign. I think we've got two of these, so take a look at that and click it on to the next one as well, if you would. Now, I don't have much time, but I do want to refer you to chapter 10 in Bob Blakey's book. You don't have to go buy this anywhere. It was published in 1980. But what Bob did in this book, The Plot to Kill the President, was to summarize the history of the organized crime challenge that our nation faced. I reread it on the airplane coming in here. Did a super job, and it relates back to that commission and talks about how Kennedy and then Mitchell reacted to the challenge. Well, it wasn't just Kennedy and Mitchell, it was Kennedy and Nixon. And what I also brought along was a May 2nd, 1969 Time article, Organized Crime Ganging Up on the Mob. 1969. During his campaign, Richard Nixon pledged to escalate dramatically the federal war on organized crime. Last week, he announced his battle plan. The battle plan is what we'll talk about today. But part of the way that worked out was through, as you point out, the Prime Minister. John Mitchell absolutely unequivocally was the Prime Minister. I worked for him. I was in 3 different positions under his leadership. And as James Rosen points out in his biography of Mitchell, Mitchell was a man of the law and a man of integrity and a strong leader for the Department of Justice. And he provided leadership with the congressional leaders that we all work for. John McClellan, Mr. Crime, started in 1957. Roman Hruska, the Republican, teamed up with McClellan, and with Mitchell, they formed a cohesive team that basically allowed these programs to move forward as they should. Now, what we've got here is that signing ceremony. Nixon, Mitchell, right behind Mitchell is John McClellan. Over here we've got Roman Hruska. Next to him is Dick Poff, very much part of this on the House side. So what we've got is basically the threat. We've got the players, and we've got the tools. Now, how did that all happen? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I would pass the buck to Pete to provide a little background on
Thank you, Wally.
that.
Pete?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome fellow artifacts and relics from a bygone era. I'd like to start my remarks by being very specific, and I allude to an event that happened at 10 a.m. on June 29th, 1967. And that's when Roman Hruska introduced on the Senate floor a package of crime bills that were the work product of a recently appointed Republican task force, congressional task force, on law and order issues. And he introduced 3 organized crime bills. First, what really became the first draft of Title III, the wiretapping legislation. Secondly, the first iteration of what later became civil RICO. And then third, authorized the federal assistance for state and local enforcement to specifically focus on organized crime intelligence activities and support. All of those later became law in the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which I'll refer to a little later on. But simultaneously, with the introduction of those bills at approximately the same time, Citizen Nixon formed an advisory committee on law and order. And Bob and I had the privilege of actually serving as advisors while we were congressional staffers to that committee. But more importantly, Mr. Nixon, who after all had been a senator for 2 years, had been the presiding officer of the Senate for 8 years, was on a very personal first-name basis with the congressional leaders who now were carrying the load to fashion these tools to fight organized crime. So you look at his message, nationwide radio message, I believe March 1968, it specifically referred to this congressional activity and these legislative initiatives. Shortly thereafter, there was a white paper issued by the Nixon campaign on organized crime. So, and this was still Citizen Nixon doing this. Well, shortly thereafter, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act came up for consideration on the Senate floor. That legislation occupied the Senate in the midst of a presidential and congressional campaign for 3.5 weeks. Debate on all of these issues and others, Title I, federal assistance to state and local criminal justice, Title III, wiretap, Title IV, the first iteration of gun control legislation, and others as well. I refer to the gun control legislation because that after Bobby Kennedy's assassination in early June, the President signed Title IV into law along with the rest of the legislation. But the Congress revisited that issue, and you had the Gun Control Act of 1968 the following September. That legislation provided a set of tools that stood the test of time now as being supremely helpful in fighting organized crime. What are gangster weapons from the 30s? J. Edgar Hoover and the Tommy guns, sawed-off shotguns, and so on. You had thousands of prosecutions against organized crime figures, large and small, based on the straightforward provisions of that Gun Control Act. You possessed a sawed-off shotgun with a barrel of less than 18 inches. Well, anybody on a jury could understand this was a bad guy using or possessing a bad gun, and that's worth 10 or 20 years in the federal penitentiary. So this was another piece of legislation that became very effective. Now we jump forward to the Nixon administration. April 23rd, 1969, he sent a special message to Congress on organized crime. We'll hear more from Bob on that score. But at the same time, that message charged my agency, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, with building programs specifically to fight organized crime with state and local law enforcement partners. And there is, if I can go back to that chart, you'll see 8 red dots. And these represented LEAA regional offices. For example, the Boston office set up the first regional organized crime intelligence system in cooperation with 5 state attorneys general. Florida, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, San Francisco, Kansas City, and so on. All of these major programs were developed with federal assistance to marshal state and local resources and assets to deal with it. The last thing I want to mention, of course, is civil RICO. The original draft, the RICO bill of June of 1967, became Title IX of the Crime Control Act of 1970. And Bob and I worked on that legislation jointly as it worked its way through Congress, and Bob then became, I guess, the leading authority on that subject subsequently. So that you can see a comprehensive approach on the part of Mr. Nixon personally and the Nixon administration, top priority, dedicating significant assets and resources, personnel to combat organized crime.
Thank you, Pete. And now we turn to Bob.
I'd like to thank the archivists for putting this together. It's a useful opportunity to talk to people in the next generation who will make an effort to try to understand these things. First thing I have to absolutely correct, these are Republicans. I'm a Democrat. Dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I worked for Robert Kennedy as a Democrat, and subsequently I worked for John McClellan as a Democrat. It's nice to talk about Democrats and Republicans, but what I think this panel will focus on is how Democrats and Republicans can work together, which is probably not too, doesn't illustrate what's going on in our society today. Roscoe Pound, who was the dean of the Harvard Law School for 15 or 20 years, and one of the leading authorities on crime and crime control, among other things, said that you needed 4 things for an effective criminal justice system. Got to have good substantive law, you got to have a good procedure, you got to have good organization, and you got to have good people. If you don't, any one of those things are missing, you can't make the thing work. I want to talk about all of those together and how these things came together. But the most significant thing for me, when I reflect back on my involvement in this, is the people involved. And I want to focus on that. I was a staffer for John McClellan, who was the chairman of the Rackets Committee, as it's so called, and he was willing to take that when nobody else did, and he conducted a nationwide investigation of unions, and in particular the influence of organized crime in the unions. Let me drop a footnote there. I'm an academic, so I got to put a footnote in. I'm talking about one specific group in organized crime, what's known in Chicago as the Outfit, in Buffalo as the Arm, La Cosa Nostra in New York. Popularly, it's the Mafia. I'm not talking about Italian Americans. It's like when Joe Valachi, the first member of an organized crime family that testified before Congress, said, this is the quote, "Senator, I'm not talking about Italians, I'm talking about criminals." And that's my point. The Mafia does not exhaust all of the groups in organized crime. It just so happens in 1963, which is this chart represents, it was the largest single nationwide effective group in organized crime. It was put together in the 30s, and from the 30s till Valachi's testimony in 63, nobody, 30 years, nobody ever said publicly that there was an organized crime group. The sociologists, the criminologists, all dismissed this notion of organized crime in the sense of a group like the Mafia. Joe Valachi appeared before the McClellan Committee, testified identifying individuals and families. And this is what it looked like at this time. That this particular chart is based on FBI intelligence. That after the Kennedy administration began, and I was in the meeting, Bobby Kennedy just exploded because he had been the chief counsel for the McClellan Committee, and he knew these people. He held hearings on these people. And he looked at the files that the FBI had, and they were largely empty of anything but newspaper articles. And he said to Courtney Evans, who was his liaison, I can't actually say on television what he said, but the substance of it is get off your duff and go get the information we need to do the prosecutions. The FBI did, and the intelligence for the chart is up on the board. When I had come with the department in 1960, August of 1960, I went out to lunch with a man named Henry Peterson, who was the deputy section of my committee, of the Organized Crime and Racketeering section. And I asked him, Henry, is there a mafia? And he told me no. There are loose associations from place to place, but there is no organized crime in that sense. In June of 1962, we got in the organized crime section what we call the commission report. And we went from no mafia to the mafia looking like this. And the tools that we had available to us to investigate it were basically grand juries and some legislation that had been developed in the 30s. This is what the statute is called the Hobbs Act, the Anti-Racketeering Act of 33. And we went out and we thought it was successful if we got a conviction of a mafioso, a conviction. When President Nixon issued this crime statement that we referred to, he makes the point in that statement that the federal government, with all its powers, and nobody ever said we were incompetent, nobody ever said we were corrupt, had not succeeded in destroying one of these families. There are 22 families in all the major areas of the United States. The estimates were that were approximately 5,000 made members, not associates, made members, 5 families in New York City, And we hadn't destroyed one family from 60, when Bobby Kennedy came in, until 68 when Nixon was elected. And that was always thought to be the top organized crime drive at the federal level. We were not successful, period, end of story. That's kind of the background, but what happened is there was a coming together, if you will, of planets, and they all lined up. John McClellan was interested in organized crime. He'd investigated them, and he wanted to legislate. If you don't have help across the aisle, you can't do it by yourself. He had, and I think of him, I shouldn't say this as Tweedledum and Tweedledee, because then you're going to ask me, well, which one was Tweedledum? Two guys, John McClellan and Roman Oruska, were like this on these issues. I've been in meetings with them off the Senate floor, and it was almost like they were a couple, and believe me, they were not a couple. He would say one thing, and the other one would finish the sentence. Those two people came together with John Mitchell and Richard Nixon and Poff from the House. Those people sitting together said, yes, we can do this, and these are the things that we have to do. That's a remarkable story. I don't see it going on today. It led to the legislation, the wiretap statute in '68, the Organized Crime Control Act in 1970, and you put them together, and what difference did it make? We created a witness protection program so that if people would be willing to testify against organized crime, they could be protected. We created the RICO Act, which authorizes investigations and prosecutions of organized crime. We had wiretapping and electronic surveillance, which is an electronic substitution for witness testimony. We had the sentencing guidelines that authorized and indeed required appropriate sentences. Sentencing guidelines, Roman Oruska was the senator who talked about reforming these things. You put those things together, and we had the following impact. From 5,000 members is today approximately 1,200. From 22 families all throughout the United States, none outside of New York. And of the 5 families in New York, there are probably 2 today that are good. You have street gangs that call themselves the mafia in other places. It's just not there anymore. Is that a success story? The answer is yes. Is it a permanent success story? The answer is no. If we don't keep pressure on them, they'll reformulate and recreate what you see there. And one of the impacts of 9/11 is that the FBI has shifted its people from organized crime to terrorism. It's not a bad idea. The mafia wanted the building, and the terrorists want to blow it up. And if I have to choose between the two, I'll take anti-terrorism any time. But the mafia issue is what we learned, and we now means John McClellan investigation, its implementation in the street, is there is no criminal group or terrorist group in the United States, or I frankly think in the world, that we do not now have the tools, and we know the organizational techniques, that we can't destroy them. And who's responsible for that? Nixon, McClellan, Oruska, Poff, in the Senate, and then in the House. And now it depends on whoever runs the Department of Justice and the FBI as to whether it's done. So that's my part of the story.
Thank you, Bob. Now, we've given you insights we again decided, because this was so wonderfully complicated, that we would develop a study guide so we wouldn't have to keep footnoting everything we were talking about on the different legislation and the different aspects. And we're going to put that together after the program's over. So if you really want to get into it, look for the study guide. Before we start the discussion, we're going to show you the second of the network's coverage of the signing of the Organized Crime Control Act. And you can see some differences. Remember with the first one, with CBS, you didn't see much of the president's speech. Dan Rather told you what was in the bill, and you saw the actual signature. This is going to show you a little bit more of the speech itself, but not have the same summary of the bill. It's intriguing how the networks differed in their control and coverage. So let's go to that.
A few weeks ago, law and order was an issue in the forthcoming elections. Now the epidemic of bombings has made it into the issue. It took Congress 9 months to do it, but this week, before adjourning, it acknowledged the heat and passed the administration's big anti-crime package. Today, the president signed it. ABC White House correspondent Tom Jarrow reports.
The ceremony was in the Great Hall at the Justice Department, applauded with the president, with the top federal lawmen, including Attorney General Mitchell and FBI Director Hoover. Bipartisan congressional leaders were also present. The president described the bill as a tool which lawmen can now use to fight organized crime and terrorist bombers.
Now that they have these tools, I think that we can say that we shall now be able to launch a total war against organized crime, and we will win this war. And it seems that every day we pick up the papers and we see some sporadic incident without reason, without cause, simply a terrorist activity which we have not been able to cope with adequately in the past. Now, what this legislation does is to provide that where there is a federal interest, federal support for an installation, then the federal law enforcement officials will move in. I think that this should be a warning to those who engage in these acts that we, in this country, are not going to tolerate that kind of activity in the future, and that the full force of the federal government, and particularly of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, will be brought against these actions wherever there is a federal interest. And I think that at this time to point out that the actions of the FBI in apprehending Angela Davis, a rather remarkable story again in the long history of remarkable stories of apprehensions by the FBI, is an indication that once the federal government, through the FBI, moves into an area, this should be warning to those who engage in these acts that they eventually are going to be apprehended. This is a warning. By signing this bill, we're going to give the tools to the men in the Justice Department and the men in the FBI, and we shall see to it that those who engage in such terroristic acts are brought to justice.
The sweeping anti-crime measure, which includes the death penalty for fatal bombings, became law with the president's signature. Immediately afterward, the president visited the headquarters of the District of Columbia Police Department. Enthused by a decline in the D.C. crime rate, the president congratulated the men in uniform and their civilian support staff.
So that involved the second segment. Now, to open our discussion, which is what we've come to hear, this comes across as a magic moment when politics may have been set aside and people really worked together to address this challenge. What was unique about that era? What enabled this to happen? Wally?
I'll start. The two senators were, this is my opinion, two senators were talking about McClellan and Hruska were in the Senate and committed to it as an institution. They were, in fact, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. One was real focused on criminal law, and one was real focused on criminal justice. But they did work in total harmony. Now, having said that, I'd go back to about 1950 with the Kefauver hearings, because, in fact, as Bob points out, we're watching the emergence of a criminal the information about a criminal organization that was denied until well into the mid-60s by the FBI director, Mr. Hoover. But it was happening. And with the prime ministers, they basically were of one mind with respect to the objective. They weren't arguing about the details. They had one thing in mind, and they went and did it. Now, I would let the historic record reflect that the successes were not achieved by the Department of Justice until Blakey and I were gone. That says, in fact, that our skills were better utilized elsewhere.
Well, if Senators Haruska and McClellan got together and worked and acted as a team, how about you and Bob and Pete? Or Pete and Bob and you and Bob?
Let me kind of answer that. People sometimes say that I'm the guy that drafted RICO, and it is literally true. I did it on yellow sheets, legal pads at home. No. It was John McClellan. I didn't do anything that I didn't run by him, and if he said no, it would be the end of it. For example, when we processed the Organized Crime Control Act in the Senate, we didn't have the civil RICO provision in it. And one of the reasons it was taken out, and this is a very personal one, is I didn't know enough about antitrust, and they were modeled on antitrust. Pete modeled them on antitrust for Haruska, and I didn't know enough that I could make a good recommendation to McClellan. So we kind of took them out. When they got in the House, the ABA came back and said, put them back in. So we did in the House. When I say the we, Congressman Poff was coordinating with McClellan. Very unusual. Here's the second-ranking Republican in the House Judiciary Committee, was on a day-to-day basis talking with Haruska and McClellan in the Senate. You don't normally think of it going this way. They went back in, and the plan by Congressman Seller in the House was to kill the bill. And the way they were going to kill the bill is, let me back up. Congressman Seller was going to kill the bill in the committee. And not the Democrats, the Republicans in the House began developing a discharge petition for it. And the only way they could get credibility with the discharge petition was if the White House supported it. So this is now Nixon. Some of the Senate people were putting pressure on Congressman Seller. His plan was to report the bill out and then kill it in conference. Everybody knows you got to have two bills, and then there's a conference report. If the conference report never reports, that ends the bill. Seller was going to kill it, absolutely. But what I think Seller never knew was that McClellan and Haruska and Poff worked in the Judiciary Committee to get what they would normally have gotten in the out of conference. So the bill comes back over to the Senate, and we send it directly. Senator McClellan walks out on the floor, Senator Haruska's out on the floor, and basically they tell the Senate, we got what we need. There's no reason to go to conference. Send it to Nixon to be signed. And now that's unusual. That's extremely, I was there from more or less from 68 to the mid-70s. That's extraordinary for a way to get a bill through. It went. Could that have been done without the people? The personalities involved? The answer is no.
Let me recap that just for a second, because I stumble through this. Manny Sellers of New York was chairman of House Judiciary,
right,
and chairman of the subcommittee. So you normally need four. You need minority and minority for both House and Senate. And in this discussion, he's odd man out.
Yes.
You've got Haruska and McClellan in the Senate. That's wired. You've got Poff in the
That's
House.
Republicans
And Democrats.
and Democrats.
Conservative Southern Democrats, but Democrats. But you didn't have that in the House. And so, in essence, the challenge to get the bill out is to roll many cellars.
Yes.
And the way you did it, this is really, I didn't know this, that Poff, you had a conference without a conference.
Right.
The House version was the conference. So the Senate just approved the House bill.
Yes.
And all coordinated with the Department of Justice.
Oh, Department of Justice was involved in all of it. So that everybody but Seller and Ben Zelenko, who was his chief counsel, knew what was going on. He thought it was the traditional thing. It would pass, report out, pass in the House, and they'd call over for a conference committee. And when I talked to Zelenko, he said, well, you know, when do you want to set the conference committee up? They were going to kill it in conference. And I said, well, Ben, I don't think we'll have a conference. Mm-hmm. We're going to send it right over to the president. Bang, and there it went. And so you got a bill.
That was unique. Wally?
Let me shift gears just a little bit.
Sure.
Two significant things happened under President Nixon and through President Nixon, but during this period of time we're talking about 1960 to 1975. There was a redefinition of the role of federal criminal law. Understand, and we know this, but many people may not, virtually 95% of all criminal proceedings are state and or local. 5% are federal. Well, what happened back in the early years? Hoover said we don't have the tools. There was a law I affectionately regard as ITAR, Interstate Transportation and Aid of Racketeering, that was written during the Kennedy years that basically federalized certain state crimes that involve business activities. And it evolved to a point where we get wiretapping and RICO. Now, the fact is the wiretapping, the witness immunity, and RICO, in my mind, are the major federal tools. There may be a lot more, like the gun control Pete was talking about. But for me, those, because that's the framework of my own experience. But something else happened. In other words, we were dealing with the federal jurisprudence that Bob and I were focused on. But the Nixon administration created a program where they substantially aided upgrading state and local law enforcement. That's Pete's part of this.
And that's what Pete was paying for. He was writing personal checks.
That's right.
The Law Enforcement Assistance Administration.
So there was a two-pronged attack here, I guess is my point.
And one of the impacts of that, we now, a majority of states, have state racketeering legislation. A majority of states now have electronic surveillance. I'd like to see a majority use them, but they don't. And if there hadn't been not only the feds doing it, but the federal aid to law enforcement, that law enforcement activity at the state level with the tools would not have happened. So what you see is really unique, where you have the House, the Senate, the President, thinking about law enforcement tools, thinking about what the federal role can be, thinking about what the state role can do, and stepping up to the plate and being willing to pay for it. And they did through the LAEA. It's what I don't see my government doing now. See them talking about lowering taxes and increasing services, and, well, that's another story.
I would like to return first to a point that Bob made. As I recall, Senator Ruska recommended a certain consultant to Senator McClellan, who later became the chief counsel of that subcommittee. And so there was strong bipartisan support.
Bob is Haruska's creation?
Well, he was certainly his strong recommendation as an expert on organized crime and wiretapping. And although Haruska introduced the first wiretapping bill, he essentially took the Blakey draft of it in June of '67, as I referred to.
I'd worked for the Katzenbach Commission that studied crime in the United States and studied organized crime and recommended it to it a wiretapping legislation. The commission adopted that recommendation, and then it went over to the Department of Justice that at that time was run by Katzenbach and ultimately Ramsey Clark. It went right down the tubes. The Republicans in the House, with Poff and Senator Ruska in the Senate, said, we want this on the table. And so they took one of my drafts, took a draft of mine, but it was based in part on other people. I don't want to get to the point where I'm saying I did it all. I shamelessly plagiarized it from any source I could find. And then what happened is I did come to work for Senator McClellan. And what he told me to do is say, take my wiretapping bill, which was an older one, take Senator Ruska's bill and merge them. You know, plagiarize, take these two and produce a new one. And that's the one that we were able to get through the Senate.
And that was jointly sponsored by Ruska and McClellan.
Absolutely.
Strong bipartisan support just beyond those two.
What comes through here, look, slightly different point. It's not just to have this commonality of interest with the elected representatives, the senators and Congressman Poff, but you've got these staff people who were salted by the Department of Justice. I mean, you've got prosecutors like Bob Blakey and Wally Johnson who were on the front line. I mean, you were running the strike force in Miami. You knew what tools you had, what you didn't have, what worked, what didn't work.
What he really learned, and Wally, we learned when I was in the department and when Wally was in it, we saw the problem and we saw we didn't have the tools to deal with it, right?
Absolutely.
Well, we talk about the revolving door, and we mean people coming in and out of government from the private sector back in to regulate the private sector, going back out to the private sector. But here you had a completely different kind of revolving door. You had experienced prosecutors end up as Senate staff. How unique is that kind of revolving door?
It wasn't unique then. Now, in our case, it was unique because it was part of the chemistry that made it all work. Bob, in his book, Chapter 10, suggests that the wind went out of the program after Kennedy was assassinated. The fact is, the coterie of organized crime prosecutors became the significant practitioners at the criminal bar for the next 20 years. In other words, that was an extremely successful program, and it attracted pretty good attorneys. Now, we went to the Hill, but a lot of people went into private practice and
as defenders or prosecutors?
Both.
Okay. Okay.
Both. And I would call attention to a book written by Jeff Shepard that addressed this subject in great detail, how basically the prosecutors from the Department of Justice found their way into virtually every major criminal type litigation for the next 20, 30 years.
You play a little unfair, but the point you made when we were talking about the book was Robert Kennedy had assembled as Attorney General the cream of the cream of lawyers in the Department of Justice. He was so intense and so interested in what was going on and attracted really top people.
Let me be bipartisan about that. When the Eisenhower administration came in, they had to deal with what was left over, frankly, from Franklin Roosevelt and Truman, and it was basically largely at the staff level, a corrupt and incompetent Department of Justice. You could work in the Department of Justice and have an outside practice. And the Eisenhower administration eliminated that, and they put in what was called an honors program. Instead of recruiting people normally, they would go to the best law schools, theoretically, and get the best students. Those people were brought into the department. It wasn't Bobby Kennedy. It was the people hired from law school on a non-partisan basis, based simply on merit. And when the Kennedy administration came in, what he did is he concentrated a number of those honors program people already solicited, and then some people came later and put them into the section.
And just to help me, you had merit hiring because these were lawyers, these were licensed practitioners, so you didn't have civil service exams.
No,
you
no.
could be hired directly in from this.
This was
recruitment program.
merit hires from law schools, and then they took us and put us down in the organized crime section.
And both you and Wally
Yes.
are from that program,
Right.
different era, but from that program.
And then, of course, we found out, you say we're supposed to chase organized crime, well, why don't you give us the tools? And nobody was ever, now we kind of knew what the tools were. We didn't know about RICO, but we knew about wiretapping, couldn't get it through. But for McClellan and Hruska knowing it, it wouldn't have happened. Pop was in it. When Nixon came in, he would sign the legislation. And that we didn't have a president that would sign it beforehand. Let me tell you a very short story. John McClellan went down to the White House and sat with Johnson and said, "You've asked me to represent you on the Hill with this federal aid to law enforcement. I would like to, federal aid to state and local law enforcement. I'd like to have some criminal procedure legislation. I'd like to have a wiretap bill. If I can put it on the Law Enforcement Administration bill, will you sign it?" And he said, "Yes. You sponsor the federal aid to law enforcement bill, and that's fine. If you can, in a fair fight, amend it for wiretapping, I'll sign it." Ramsey Clark didn't know anything about this. In fact, unless he sees this, he won't even know about it, ever. He recommended to President Johnson that he veto the bill.
Because it had wiretap in it.
Among other things, because it had wiretap in it. And I showed the newspaper article to Senator McClellan. He proceeds to tell me the story. He's going to sign the bill. I don't care what the recommendation is.
I have a deal.
Johnson, I have a deal with Johnson, and Johnson will come through it. That's how it got signed. Think of what had to happen to get that one signed. When Nixon came in, he sends a message up. I want this kind of legislation. And if you go through the Organized Crime Control Act, Nixon had recommended all of the major provisions that are in the Organized Crime Control Act, including civil RICO. Yeah. So,
well, the hit always is on these policy issues, whether it was a confluence of others, whether the president himself was personally interested and personally involved. And in the course of our research and discussion, I grandiosely said organized crime wasn't a campaign issue, and Wally called me up and said, "Well, we've got the books, we've got the statements, what else did you want?" But Wally, you have more.
Well, and you didn't have to prompt me on this because I was picking up off Bob. 2 weeks after I went from the criminal division to Hruska's office, and it was when Pete went from Hruska's office to LEAA. In other words, there was a shuffling of responsibilities and positions. The senator called me and said, "I want you to supervise a summer intern I've got, David Eisenhower." Mm-hmm. So Bob and I worked with Dave for 3 months on the Organized Crime Act and exposed him to the processes in the federal government. Now, I've never figured out how Eisenhower came to Hruska, but it was serendipitous because here was the president's son-in-law talking about organized crime, understanding it, meeting with J. Edgar Hoover, being educated in the complexities of this legislation, and understanding the nature of the problem. And I can't imagine that the president was not, well, I know the president was part of those conversations. So we've got this 20-year period, this period from 1950 to 1970, where Nixon's part of the Senate. He's one of the members of that club. These are his friends. John Mitchell, the strong man, is his attorney general. I prosecuted under both Republicans and Democrats, and in both situations, I was made specifically aware that I should be totally nonpartisan and professional and play by the book. And I did that for both administrations. The department was entirely nonpartisan in this regard.
And that was certainly the case under John Mitchell as Attorney General. He let all of his key people in the department know this is a nonpartisan, by the book Justice Department, and you'll act accordingly. He totally, and particularly in my program, where we were giving grant money to state and local law enforcement, and most of it through block grants according to population formulas. That's the way it was, and we dealt equally with Republican and Democratic state and local administrations in the same exact way, and that was at the insistence, and I might say the leadership of the Attorney General, who after all was a municipal bond lawyer. He knew state and local politics a lot better than just about any other lawyer, and he really provided very senior advice and counsel to us young folks trying to distribute that money based on many years of experience. But that's exactly the way it was administered. I'd also like to call attention to the fact that one of the programs that the Attorney General directed LEA to initiate was what was called Criminal Justice Standards and Goals. And several task forces were set up. One of those was on organized crime. And two of our participants here happened to be very distinguished members of that task force, which spent 4 years and came up with a report of several hundred black letter recommendations to guide and develop state and local anti-organized crime programs. And these folks provided direct leadership in that effort.
And two of the recommendations were electronic surveillance, court-order electronic surveillance, not without court supervision, and racketeering type legislation. And then the LEAA provided money to assist state and local groups do it. I had, not personally, but I don't remember whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. Senator in Florida hired me on an LEAA grant to go down to Florida and draft a racketeering legislation and wiretapping. I went to Arizona on an LEAA grant to help Bruce Babbitt, who was then the Attorney General of Arizona, put through racketeering type legislation. So it was like integrated. Money was available, expertise was available, and people changed. Would that have ever happened without Nixon? Remember, I'm a Democrat. Would that have ever happened without Nixon? No. Would that have ever happened without Haruska, McClellan, and Poff? No.
Let me switch just for a second and go through what to me have been the three key new tools. We talk about them, but we haven't used examples of how they work. And Pete, what I'd like you to talk about is the gun control stuff, because in our prep, you mentioned precisely how that was used and how effective that was.
The 1968 Gun Control Act modernized two existing previous laws on gun control. One on sporting firearms and the other on machine guns and automatic weapons. Senator Haruska was the architect and draftsman of the automatic weapons legislation that had been largely rendered moot by several Supreme Court decisions which said you couldn't have federal registration of firearms and then tell state and local folks about it and then prosecute as a matter of state law if you registered in the federal law. But that was modernized. A whole new gamut of sentencing alternatives developed in the context of the gun control legislation. And then a whole new category of federal criminal activity for possessing, transporting firearms across state lines by convicted felons, illegal aliens, and so on. A whole basket of new federal prosecutory tools to go after the bad guys. Now, you could say,
I remember, just to clarify, the game that used to be played was the federal government taxed the ownership of a machine gun.
Right.
So you had to pay the tax, and the minute you paid the tax, they told the state and the state prosecutor.
Exactly.
And that's what the court said, gee, this isn't quite what we had in mind.
Slight Fourth Amendment problem.
Yes, yes. But then, I'm sorry, I interrupted, but you were going on about the prosecutions under these statutes.
Yes, and in addition, of course, LEA provided funds to state and locals to modernize their gun control legislation, so you had concurrent jurisdiction, if you will, in these heavy-duty criminal activities involving the use of firearms.
And since you had mandatory sentences that increased if you were had been convicted before, I mean, it was kind of a multiplier.
Well, amazingly, within the confines of one piece of federal legislation, you had an entire gamut of sentencing alternative, from indeterminate sentence to minimum mandatory to death penalty. So depending on the charge, you had, a real, as I say, a basket full of prosecutorial and sentencing options.
And so if you're faced with a soldier, a low-level person who's caught with a firearm, they could be going down for the last time, and it would give you a greater opportunity to flip them.
Exactly.
Because you had these things you could prosecute in order to go up the chain.
Simple possession was a federal felony offense, for example, 10 years just for that one offense. And that was a very effective tool. Juries could understand it. Prosecutors had no problem proving prima facie cases. You've got that shotgun. It's only got a 12-inch barrel, and that's it.
You're in trouble, son.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, let's go. So that's gun control. That's how gun control is used in a coordination fashion. Go to wiretapping. Explain, if you would, the value, the complication.
It's simple for me, but before I answer that specifically, let me make sure the record shows that not only were Hruska and McClellan key on the authorization committee, they were also ranking and chair and ranking on the appropriations committee for justice. Understand how interwoven this was.
Oh, that's where the money comes from.
That's where the money comes from. That's where the money comes from. So not only did they have a handle on what the Justice Department was supposed to be doing or could do or should do, they funded it.
Senator McClellan was, at that time, the chairman of Senate investigations, permanent subcommittee investigation. He could investigate anything in the country. He made a major effort to spend time on organized crime. He then wanted to do some legislation. And so he got from Senator Eastland a subcommittee on crime. And while he was a minority counsel and I was the chief counsel, he was deeply involved in 5 committees. I won't name them all. He was also on appropriations. McClellan and Hruska was on appropriations.
Yes.
Yeah.
McClellan and Hruska could investigate, legislate, and pay for
Appropriate.
and appropriate. in the areas of crime and crime control. And when they finally got somebody in like Mitchell, instead of Ramsey Clark, you had it working. The system was not working against each other. The system was working in favor of it. I think it was the planets came together very nicely. The people were there. The staff people were saying, Senator, let's do this, Senator, let's do that, writing articles. Nothing happens. You get the planets in charge. Our government actually works if you get the people to work together. It did in 68, 69, 70 in a really remarkable way.
Let me give you.
Let me make Wally go back to wiretap.
Okay, and I'll make
And then I'm going to come to RICO.
Okay.
So you get to think about your answer.
For me, wiretapping was a key tool. RICO was another one, and witness immunity was
Sure.
the third
Okay.
for me. But I dealt with the mafiosa in the field. They were not nice people. They were antisocial. They had no limitations on their, they had no conscience. They would kill you and not blink an eye. Now, having said that, if at least the three of us remember quite clearly, there was a code of omerta, code of silence. It wasn't easy to flip them. It wasn't easy to get them to testify. They didn't care. They were totally without scruples. And putting the squeeze on them was not simple. So you had to figure out what they were going to be what were they talking about? And in fact, there became the constitutionally protected wiretapping was a critical tool. Why? Because you could figure out, you could get evidence. It's that simple. And you were able to break down this code of omerta. Now, I don't think, in another time, another story, that it was impenetrable. Once they started to flip, they flipped.
You mean there was no halfway?
Well, let me give you a concrete example. They were prosecuting John Gotti, was the head of the family in New York. The underboss, the guy next down, is a man named Sammy Gravano. And they played tapes of John Gotti talking about he didn't trust Sammy the Bull anymore, and he was thinking about killing him. That was, the FBI agents played those tapes to Gravano, and Gravano suddenly decides, I'm better off with the government than I am with John Gotti. He then testifies. And here you have a guy who's killed, I don't know, 15, 20 people, testifying. Could you believe him against Gotti and company? Could you believe him? Not really. But now you had wiretap and bugging tapes that corroborated what he said.
Okay.
And the tapes led to him flipping, and then he gave you details that went beyond the stuff you got on the tapes. You had a solid prosecution against John Gotti and other people. They're gone. Between 1981 and 1991, 16 bosses were prosecuted, principally through witness protection, wiretapping, and RICO. And then the family, I mean, to just take out the leadership of the family. I said the organized crime program thought, get one mafioso conviction. It was a big deal. They were taking out families. It was in this period of time they had what they called the commission case, which was the first prosecution of the heads of the families in New York. Prosecuted all at one time. And some of them got 100-year sentences. How are you going to serve out 100-year sentences?
Right. How are you going to come back?
It's not a question of deterrence. It's not a question really of punishment. It's isolation. You put them away, then they don't cause you problems anymore. That was good people, good organization, good substance, and good procedure.
Okay, I want to drive this home because I'm back to Wally for a second. So the wiretap is not just the evidence. It's an element of the case. because if you flip somebody, they can explain what was really on the tape. You heard him say this, what he really meant was this. And you get it in because there's a conspiracy alleged. So you don't have a hearsay problem. I mean, we're getting off in the weeds on legal stuff, but the rough analogy, if you'll forgive me, is these forums explain the importance of the legislation and the papers. And a flipped witness explains the wiretap and how it fits in. Okay. So that you could have a comprehensive prosecution.
And here's what we had, and this goes back to what Bob and Pete were talking about before. Before any of these legislative initiatives and the planets were aligned with the people. 18 U.S.C. 1952 was the tool.
Which is?
Whosoever shall use a facility in interstate commerce to engage in an unlawful activity shall be guilty and punished. An unlawful activity is a business enterprise involving gambling, arson, extortion, or bribery.
Okay.
That was the tool we had, thanks to Bobby Kennedy, and because J. Edgar Hoover said, I don't have anything to work with. Now, the fact is, my experience with the FBI agents on the street was excellent. The people I had in Miami were creme de la creme of investigators. But they were directed as to what their priorities were. And Bob pointed out quite neatly that if you don't have people paying attention to criminal activity will reemerge, because we're talking about a sociological phenomena.
When the first prosecution's under in 1951, I'm sorry, 1952.
Wow, you are old.
No, 1952 was the Reading dice game case. And all we had was FBI surveillance and 2 or 3 flipped witnesses. And we had a raid on the dice game case. We were not able to prove that the ownership of that dice game was by the Profaci family in New York. And the reason we didn't have the ability to prove it is we didn't have electronic surveillance of the communications between New York and Reading, Pennsylvania.
So you can get the guy rolling the dice or keeping the book, but you can't work up the chain.
That's exactly right. We were successful in the Reading dice game case. No, we weren't. All we got was what we could see on the place. Mm-hmm. And without the ability to listen to phones and bug cars and flip witnesses, you'd never get it back to Profaci in New York. That's what wiretapping is. Easy on. We had cases, sure, but at what level were they? They weren't at the highest levels.
And just to reiterate, because you made the point earlier, but this is what was authorized was court-approved wiretapping.
Absolutely.
Right. Where the evidence was admissible.
Since 1968, here we go, there has not been a major police scandal at the federal or state level on electronic surveillance.
You mean where it was abused?
Yes. Well, I mean, first of all, it wasn't generally lawful, and it was still done. It was once the federal statute went through that authorized it, under the court order system, the police didn't do it illegally to get evidence.
Sure.
They did it lawfully to get evidence. So the statute that authorized the police to do it under very limited circumstances had the result of them only doing it under those circumstances and not abusing it. So it was a positive privacy protecting aspect. It wasn't just law enforcement. It was a privacy protection aspect. People don't talk about that too much.
I'm gonna switch now to RICO. So, because you know what you drafted it. You know what the letters stand for. Why don't you explain what it was and how it worked?
Okay, the words are racketeer influence and corrupt organizations. And the title is significant. Racketeer influence and corrupt organizations. The corrupt organizations are like the mafia. And that was Senator McClellan's major concern. And the racketeer influenced organizations were legitimate businesses that in some sense had been taken over. That was Senator Ruska's concern. The label on the bill gave you exactly what the bill was all about, at a minimum. what was the bill all about? Well, RICO is really several different things at one time. First, it's a theory of investigation. That is to say, it redirected with the substantive law the way in which the FBI investigated cases. In the old days, they investigated individuals for individual crimes. They could prosecute somebody and bring him in for an individual crime, and they did that occasionally. But that's all you saw. When RICO came in, you had different elements in the crime. You not had only the individual crime, you asked the question, was that individual crime part of a pattern of crimes?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the evidence of the pattern came in, but that meant that the FBI had to go out and investigate them. One element of the crime is an enterprise. The definition is whoever employed by or associated with an enterprise engages in a pattern of criminal behavior meaning violence, provision of illegal goods and services, corruption. That meant the FBI had to go out and investigate enterprises. Wow. When I was in the department, I prosecuted Anthony Ricardo in Chicago.
Give us a year.
For tax evasion. This is 162.
Okay.
Got a conviction. Was reversed on appeal for publicity. The publicity problem was that the word mafia had been used in the newspapers, not in the courtroom. After RICO, you could introduce mafia words. This guy is not only involved in this crime, he's involved in it as a capo regime in the Gambino family. So what was known in the newspapers was legally made relevant in a courtroom.
Because it was an enterprise.
Because it was an enterprise and because it was a pattern. That's and the investigation had to be that way. That required the Department of Justice in the FBI to change the way they investigated. It's a theory of trial. It lets you not only put in the individual crimes, it's the connection between the individual crimes and an organization of some sort. It's also a theory of sanction. Investigation, prosecution, and sanction. It has in it provisions for forfeiture. In the old days, we had fines that were discretionary in amount but fixed in number. Under the forfeiture provision, it's mandatory in application and flexible in the amount. You go into a drug transaction, you come up with $100,000 gross, not net, the government can forfeit that $100,000, either the actual money itself or anything that is a substitute for it.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, it takes the profit out of crime. So it has a forfeiture notion, and it has up to 20 years sentence. Normally, you don't need the death penalty. 20
years will do it.
20 years will do it if they serve most of it. It goes beyond that. It's not only a theory of sanction for crime, it's a theory of civil. This is Senator Orozco now, talking about civil RICO. McClellan was not that concerned about civil RICO. This is Orozco, to be candid. When I was in the department, one of the principal unions that we investigated was the Teamsters Union. We got a conviction of Jimmy Hoffa. We got a conviction of, if I go down the list of the presidents of the Teamsters Union, and my point is, you convicted each one, seriatim, and what happened to the Teamsters Union?
They promoted.
Nothing. It stayed like it was. Civil RICO comes in and says that you can sue a corrupt union, substitute a government trustee for it, and take out civilly all the mafioso. One union, give me an example, one union, civil union in northern New Jersey, Local 560, had 4 or 5 prosecutions of the leadership. One of them was when I was in the department, a man named Provenzano. Provenzano went to jail, and his brother went in. He went to jail, and his sister-in-law went in. And they put in a civil trusteeship over that union. And it took 12 years to eliminate all of the mafioso that were in that local, until finally one day they had a party in the federal court, in which the federal court really
Remove the civil.
absolutely lifted it, and now you have in Local 560 Northern New Jersey not being run by the mob. There were 4 major unions: the hotel and restaurant workers, the Teamsters, the laborers, and International Longshoremen Association, that there were multiple criminal prosecutions against, and they remained mob-dominated. There is now a continued civil civil trusteeship on the Teamsters Union. It is to today that it is not clean, but I'm telling you, under the current Jimmy Hoffa Jr., it is night and day than it was when I was there. The other 3 unions, you don't even hear about the laborers, you don't even hear about the hotel and restaurant workers. I think they're clean. I could be wrong about that, but I think they're clean. And the longshoremen, they're still struggling with that. But the civil thing, not just put them in jail, but just like you can take over a prison and bring it up to standard, or you take over a hospital or bring it up to standard, or take over a school and desegregate it, bring it up to standard, you can, through civil RICO, take over a union or any other business that is mob-dominated and clean it up civilly as well as criminally. That's a remarkable piece of legislation that changed the nature of the game.
So when
Senator Ruska.
when you make the point, and you gentlemen have, that the tools were innovative then and remain effective today.
Absolutely.
If you don't pay attention, it will come back. We can't do away with poverty and human frailty, but the tools still work.
It's a lot like garbage collection. Nobody expects to eliminate garbage. Everybody knows that if you don't clean it up, it'll build up. Organized crime control is just like, or any other kind of crime control, is just like garbage collection. Don't expect it to be perfect. Know that if you don't do it, don't get people off the street that should be off the street, they will continue. A small number of people commit most of the crime in this country. Not everybody. A small number of people. Identify them and take them off the street. Put them in prison so they don't hurt other people.
We're running out of time. We could go on for a long time on this, so we're going to end our discussion. We have, at the end, the 3rd of the national network's coverage. And I just want to chat with you for a minute. I think someday we may do a forum on the news coverage that existed at the time, because there's such a dramatic difference between what's going on. This is going to be NBC with David Brinkley. And you remember back with Dan Rather, they told you about the bill and they showed the president's signature and his comment afterwards. With CBS, that was CBS, with ABC, they didn't tell you much about the bill, but they gave you a long segment of the president's speech. This is NBC. David Brinkley's going to tell you about the bill. They're going to go show a long segment of the president's speech and then the signature and a little bit at the end. But I want to explain what's going on so you kind of enjoy this with me. The president is speaking from a stand-up microphone. There's no podium. There's no notes. You'll notice David Brinkley, when he's talking, he's looking down and he's got notes like I had when I was on the podium. The president doesn't have that. And there's no teleprompter. And he's concentrating on what he's saying. He's trying to make the point with words. And he's working on it. And he's working on it so much, there's almost no gestures. This is not a glib presentation. This is a very serious item, serious issue, and serious president. when he signs the bill, the talking points are over and the formal part of the presentation is over. And he turns and he shoves the bill at John Mitchell and J. Edgar Hoover, and that's ad-libbed. That's not planned. Here's the tool, go to work. And only then Nixon turns back to the camera and you get the politician's smile. And I happen to remember this very distinctly because I helped plan the substantive part of the ceremony. It's the difference in the president seriously trying to communicate and then the pressure being off is incredible. There's one other thing to watch. You can see Mitchell in the background. And it's so intriguing because he's bored. He's not speaking. And I'm reminded of Nancy Reagan, the story of Nancy Reagan, when she would hear the president's stump speech for the 100th time. Nancy Reagan would take a seat, she would look longingly and lovingly at her husband, and she'd never let the smile go from her face. But watch Mitchell, who's wandering all over the place. Here we go.
Now there are some new federal laws on crime meant to deal with the mafia and organized crime and whoever it is setting off bombs all over the country. For one thing, it sets the death penalty for any bomber causing a death and allows the FBI to work on bombings on college campuses. On organized crime, it is now illegal to use racket money to set up a legal business, as the mafia frequently does. And a judge may now give an extra 25 years in prison to certain adults classified as dangerous offenders. Presumably that would be professional gangsters. President Nixon signed the bill today with J. Edgar Hoover there beside him.
Last week we saw bombings in California. We saw one in Rochester. We saw one, in addition, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it seems that every day we pick up the papers and we see some sporadic incident without reason, without cause, simply a terrorist activity which we have not been able to cope with adequately in the past. We, in this country, are not going to tolerate that kind of activity in the future. The full force of the federal government, and particularly of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, will be brought against these actions wherever there is a federal interest. This bill will help. It will allow the FBI to move in to cases on a positive basis where previously they have been able to do so only when asked to do so by the local law enforcement officials. And I think that at this time to point out that the actions of the FBI in apprehending Angela Davis, a rather remarkable story again in the long history of remarkable stories of apprehensions by the FBI, is an indication that once the federal government, through the FBI, moves into an area, this should be warning to those who engage in these acts that they eventually are going to be apprehended. This is a warning. By signing this bill, we're going to give the tools to the men in the Justice Department and the men in the FBI, and we shall see to it that those who engage in such terroristic acts are brought to justice. Thank you. Gentlemen, I give you the tools, you do the job. We will.
And that concludes today's forum. I want to thank everybody for coming. I enjoyed doing these tremendously, and today's was particularly good because I think you got rare insights to what was going on behind the scenes and behind the documents. If you have watched this forum, please look for our study guide, and thank you again for coming.